Hey everyone, welcome to the Ask Ralph Show. Today we're tackling a topic that's close to all of our hearts, and that's money. Now, I've heard a lot of things about what the Bible says about money. Stuff like money's the root of all evil, or maybe if you're wealthy, God must be blessing you. But honestly, those are some pretty simplistic takes on a complex subject. So today we're going to dig deep and look at some surprising truths that might just change the way you think about wealth. Specifically, we're going to explore 11 surprising things the Bible actually says about wealth. I recently put together a blog post, and I thought it was so important to share this with you all. So buckle up, because we're about to explore some powerful scriptures that go way beyond those common misconceptions. And here's a spoiler alert. I'm also going to tell you about some exciting changes coming to the Daily Show. Well, Craig, let me start by welcoming everyone to the show. And Craig, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you joining me.
Great to be here, Ralph.
Let me share some information about Craig, because sometimes I forget to do this. Craig is actually a professor. He also has two excellent podcasts, one of which is AI Goes to College, and the other is livewellandflourish.com. And I would highly recommend that you check out both of those because they are very insightful and great pieces of information. So I wanted to start by talking. I'm sorry, Craig, did you have something to say? I apologize.
I was just saying thank you. That's all.
Oh, no, you're very welcome. And I wanted to start by telling everybody where this show is going. Now, it's not really going to impact the live show, but what I've decided to do on the daily show is I decided that it's gotten too long. That was never my intention to talk for an hour or even a half an hour. So I've been working on kind of refining the message a little bit. So I want to let everybody know that starting this coming Monday, you're going to see shorter daily shows. I'm going to really try to drill down on one specific topic, and I'm going to provide you with an achievable goal. I thought, as I looked at the show, it was just to be too much. It's really gotten to be too much. So I wanted to just let everybody know that that's the plan. So I'm going to give you one achievable goal, and then I'm going to give you a practical tip each day to achieve that goal. Now, one of the other things I'm looking to do is I'm looking to launch another weekly podcast. Yeah, like I don't have enough on my plate already. But I'm thinking about doing another weekly show because I have a lot of clients that are small business people. So I'm toying with the name Ask Ralph Your Christian Accountant, but be on the lookout for that because I'm going to be making some announcements about that soon. But it's going to be a weekly show where we maybe go into it a little deeper into the area of accounting and finance, that sort of thing. So, and like I said, I'm even looking at this is just a maybe doing a live show for small business owners as well. But I would really love to hear your feedback and your ideas on that. The easiest way to do that is to just go to justaskralph.com. Let me know your thoughts. Well, now let's get to today's topic.
Ralph, I'm guessing that's coming after tax season.
Yes, that's definitely going to come after tax season because now it's insane, Craig. I don't know what happened, but I guess April 1st came around and everybody decided, you know what? I guess it's time to do my taxes. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess you can look at it both ways. My calendar has been booked up solid for a month now. And, we've been telling the clients, listen, if you want to get on Ralph's book, it is really important that you get on there soon. So I think that's really just an important thing, but it's definitely one of those things that we've had to work on. So the big question today is, what are these 11 surprising things the Bible reveals about wealth? So that's going to be my aim today. It's going to be our aim today is to give some financial tips. Now, it's to reinforce how our faith and finances are completely intertwined. See, the Bible offers profound wisdom that should really shape not only our spiritual lives, also how we think about how we handle our money. We want to see financial freedom that is rooted in our faith. And that's really the point of why I do this show. And so I want to start off with the first thing. And this one might sting a little bit. And that's the first surprising thing. And that is wealth can actually be dangerous to your spiritual health. Remember what Mark 10:25 says. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. And see, at that point, Jesus was talking to the rich young ruler, right? A guy who had it all, but couldn't let go. It's not that money is evil, but the pursuit of it can distract us from what truly matters. So I got to ask this question, Craig, and we can have this discussion right now. Is how often do we find ourselves chasing more and more and more and forgetting about chasing God? What are your thoughts on that, Craig?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Our wealth becomes part of our view of self-worth. We count our worth by our bank accounts, which is not a good way to live. I think we just get way too attached to wealth as well. And I know you're going to get into that more here in a little bit, but it's I mean, that's a verse that's always confused me a little bit. When I was a kid, I was picturing the eye of a literal needle, and I guess that's not what it is. It was a gate in Jerusalem, but
Exactly.
still, that's a confusing one for me. So, is it bad to be wealthy? I don't think that's what the Bible's saying there.
And I think that that's the way you have to look at money is not necessarily good nor bad. It's a tool. And I think that I talk about that on the show all the time. It's really a question of how do you use that tool? I've used this analogy before. If you're a carpenter, you're going to use a hammer. And if you use the hammer correctly, you can build beautiful things. You can make beautiful homes and businesses and all that sort of thing. Now, if you take a hammer and start bashing stuff with it, well, obviously that's not its intended use. And I think that's the way we have to look at money as well, Craig. So I agree with you. That is a contradictory thing. And I think it's really hard to measure that. And if anybody's in the chat, if they want to chime in any comments, we'd be happy to take them. So let me move on to point two, which kind of goes along lines of what Craig was talking about that. And basically the idea here is God may bless you with wealth. See, on the flip side of what we just talked about, the Bible also says that God may bless you with wealth. Look at Proverbs 10:22. It tells us this. It says, the blessing of the Lord brings wealth without pain, without painful toil for it. So it's not that wealth is inherently bad. Again, you hear these contradictory type things in the scripture. You hear about, the pursuit of evil and all this kind of stuff, but it can be a blessing. But I think here's the key you have to take into consideration. We got to recognize that God is the source of that. It's not about our own hustles alone. I say this on the show all the time. It's about His provision. It's His. I get some hate mail sometimes when I say this on the show, Craig, but I say it's not yours to begin with. And that really is a stumbling block for people. And that's one of the things that we have to really take into consideration. It's the provision He's given us. And when you finally come to a point where you can accept that, the thing I think is awesome about that is it actually allows you to live more fully, because then you're not so worried about, what you're pursuing. Because listen, and I've found this in my own life as I gotten older, the things that really were interesting to me when I was younger just aren't quite as interesting now. And, not that I don't like nice stuff, and I'm by no means saying to anyone, don't have nice stuff. But I think you have to recognize how you manage it. And what I put here to talk about today is it should lead to gratitude and stewardship. That's really what it comes down to. What do you think, Craig?
You should own your things shouldn't own you. Is I think another way to say what you just said. It also gets down to attachment. I think that's a theme that I hear running through a lot of this is we get so attached to our stuff, so attached to our money, the numbers in our bank account, and that's just a recipe for disappointment ultimately.
It really is. And I think that's the sad part. I think we live in a society where people are so measured and judged by what they have. And the problem is, I say this to my wife all the time. We've been very blessed. But something could happen tomorrow that we lose everything. And if your self-worth and everything you have is tied up into that belief that, well, it's about how much is in my bank account, or it's about how much is in my investment portfolio, or this big house. Well, guess what? I know Mark's in the chat today. Mark talks about practical prepping, and guess what? There are scenarios where your house gets rolled over by a hurricane or a tornado. If that was what was if that's what was your measurement, now all of a sudden your house is gone. Like, are you worthless now? And I think that's what you're getting at, Craig, is that we tie so much up into what I call the highlight reel. What do you have? Let's put these pictures on Facebook. Let's put these pictures on Instagram and all the other social media things that we fail to think about it sometimes. That the real core of that is, what are you doing with those things?
Absolutely. Well, and there's a thing I think I might have mentioned before called hedonic adaptation. I know that's a big fancy PhD word, but basically it means that if you want to satisfy yourself through pleasure, like through owning things, it lasts a very short period of time. And then that shiny new thing isn't shiny anymore and it's not new anymore. And then you want the next shiny new thing. And they call it the hedonic treadmill. You're just constantly trying to keep up with that little dopamine rush when you get, a new vehicle or a new whatever. a new pair of shoes, whatever it might be. And it really is just a treadmill. You never get anywhere. And I think wealth can be the same way. That you get that raise and you feel really good about that for a little while. And then that wears off and you need that next thing and that next thing and that next thing. And if that's what you're feeling, you're thinking about wealth in the wrong way.
Absolutely. It's Craig. And you just set me up for the number 3 point. Fantastic job. And the third point is this.
That's
Here's a
why I'm
sobering
here.
thought. That's right. Here's a sobering thought. Wealth is temporary. And Proverbs 23:5 says, cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone. For they will surely sprout wings and fly off the sky like an eagle. Well, think about that. We need to think about that. Material possessions vanish. The market crashes, things break, and circumstances change. And I think that's why. And what does that mean from a financial perspective? I think that means we need to think about how these things are influencing our long term planning. And we need to start to prioritize eternal investments over those temporary ones. And that's really where you were going with that, Craig. I think about so many people that invest in those things that they could go away tomorrow. That car, it's great when you go, I just bought a H3 Hummer EV. I said I'd never own an EV, but I saw this thing and I said, I got to have this. This thing is cool, right? But when you drive it off the lot, it's new. It doesn't have any dings in it. There's no bumps. There's no bruises. And you think about, oh, this thing is fantastic. But if you're going to put it on the road, guess what's going to happen? Like on the way home from the car dealership, here's a great example. Down here where we live at night now, the bugs are starting to come out. So we're at the dealership and this thing's all shined up. I mean, this thing looked fantastic. Spark. Well, as I'm driving home, I'm hearing boom, boom. Psh, 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 psh. I get to the house and man, the whole front windshield is covered with bug juice. Now, if I had measured my value on how beautiful this vehicle is or how clean it was, right? Just the natural driving from point A to point B just totally destroyed that view. And I think you have to look at your wealth the same way. You have to look at it that what's important in eternality is a big word to use, but eternally, what's valuable? It's so easy to put our value in those temporary ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering how many Teslas you can put in the back of that Hummer.
It's pretty big. I think, it's funny, Craig, because I had an H2 back in the day, and those were like the big, the hogs on the gas. Well, so when I went to, like I said, I've never been a big EV person, so I'm learning all about this. It's really kind of cool. But here's the cool thing about this, right? I'm not a car guy, so I'm going to be honest. It has 835 horsepower. So
Mm.
which is just amazing, insane. So then it has this mode called launch mode. Okay. So you sit down in the car and you push a couple buttons, and this is cool, I think, right? So you put it in this launch mode and it goes 0 to 90 in 5 seconds.
Good.
Yes, and and from what I understand now, it's all about these batteries because it doesn't have a combustion engine. And so it has 3 motors in it, and this thing just takes off. But here's the problem. It all runs on electricity, so you can watch that meter of electric go as it just drops out. And so I'm learning all about that, but it's been an interesting thing. But it doesn't have that same flash, a year from now or 2 years from now. And if that's what we're defining our success in, boy, we are really going to be in for a disappointment in the future, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yep.
Which gets me to point number 4, and this is kind of what we started to talk about, and this is kind of what the teaser as I brought the show in, and that is the love of money. And, the love of money is the root of evil. I've heard this so many times. Craig, I'm sure you've heard it too. And this is one that is often misquoted. And this is what it says. It says, and this comes directly from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. It says this, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And if you read that, you're like, okay, well, money is bad. Money is evil. But the thing you've got to do is look at the context of that. What it's really saying, it's not money itself. Money itself, like I've said at the beginning of the show, is a tool. It's nothing more than a carpenter's hammer or a plumber's wrench. But the love of it, that's where it becomes that problem. That's the unhealthy attachment. That's where the problem is. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we guard our hearts from that? Craig, have you ever felt that yourself? And what have you put into practice to sort of guard your heart from that?
Well, I try to remember that money is only one form of wealth. There's a lot of other more enduring forms of wealth that are more worth pursuing. I mean, I like money. I like having nice things like most people do. But it's when money makes you stray from the right path. That's when I think that's the point of that verse. So it's the love of money and the fact that it makes you stray from the path that God intends you to be taking. And so I try to just always circle back to, is this something a good person would do? If it's whether you find a $5 bill on the floor or whatever it is, you're doing some kind of a business deal. Is this something could I use my mother? Could I look my mother in the eye and explain what I what my action was in this particular circumstance? And she was about as good as they get. And so if she approved, it was probably the right thing. But you always have to ask yourself, am I is this pursuit of material wealth pushing me down a bad path?
And it's interesting you say that, Craig, because one of the things I say to my clients that come in to get their taxes done a lot of times, they'll say to me, "Well, what do you think about this deduction, Ralph?" I said, "Well, here's the thing. Would you be able to prove it to your grandmother?" And as I say to them, I said, "Really?" I said, if your grandmother was sitting here next to us and you said, "Grandma, here's what I'm thinking about doing as far as a tax deduction." It's a silly example, but could you prove it to your grandmother? Because my experience is most people don't lie to grandma. And I think what you're really getting at, Craig, is a deeper, more seated issue. And that is, what are your motives? Check your motives. And I think that's really what this Bible verse is really talking about, is that, if love of money becomes your main motive, it becomes your first love, then now you have a problem. And I think that's an easy place to get to. I look all around us and I see people who have empty lives and lives that there's nothing that fills them up anymore. And I know why that is, or at least I should say, I think I know why that is, because they've lost the first love. And, once you've lost that first love, it's so hard to get back to where you were before. And I think you nailed it. Like you said, I mean, try to be a good person, try to guard your heart against that, and always check your motives. I think that's really the key to the whole thing.
Well, if I could add one more thing, there's a slippery slope problem here too. So the analogy I've heard is that it's really hard to cheat on your spouse the first time. It's a lot easier the second time and easier still the third time and so on and so forth. And so when you're facing a financial decision that might be kind of a little bit on the edge, if you take the wrong path once, you've kind of broken that seal. And it makes it easier to do it the next time and the next time and the next time. And then you become a dishonest person who's living for the love of money, the love of wealth, and not the love of what you ought to be living for. That makes any sense.
No, I think that's a very valid point, Craig. And it's funny, you kind of see this glamorized sort of in the gangster movies, for lack of a better explanation. They say once you have your first murder, the second one's so much easier. I have no idea what that feels like because I've never murdered anybody. But I think that's kind of what you're saying, is that once you make that decision, you use the example of, being immoral with your spouse, right? I mean, or stepping out on your spouse. And I think you're right. I think once you've crossed that bridge and maybe your conscience spoke to you, maybe that, that discernment we talk about as Christians was speaking to you, say, don't do this, don't do this. And you just wonder, like, that next time, does that discernment not speak as loudly? And I think that's what we have to guard ourselves in. And I think that's where you always have to be checking your motives and asking yourself, okay, why am I finding myself in this position? Which leads me to point number 5, and that is wealth can be, I'm sorry, go ahead, Craig.
Sorry, for the record, I got that
Yes.
example out of an article that is not from my personal life about stepping out.
Oh, gotcha. No, we want to
Very
make sure we can, yeah, we don't
Yeah.
want to get you in trouble. Absolutely not. I
In
agree
case
with you.
Tracy watches a replay, I don't want that out there.
No, I agree. Which actually, though, like I said, let me lead on to point number 5, which is wealth can be a test from God. Now, hey, wealth can even be a test from God. That's just the truth. Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 16, verse 4, talking about manna. And I talk about manna, which was what fed people in the wilderness. And it said this, it said, I will test them in this way to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. Whether we have a little or a lot, God is watching how we handle it. That's just the truth. And so these things that we're talking about right now actually perfectly led me right to number 5, Craig. And that is, it's all about our obedience and our trust. And are we generous when we have plenty? Because that's a lot of times people don't realize that is, I've heard it said, and I don't know if it's biblical or not, to whom much is given, much is expected. But the question is, are we generous when we have plenty? Are we faithful even when we don't have much? I've done a few shows on that. I kind of pick Sundays to do sort of my more deep spiritual dive. And I've said, how do you maintain your giving? How do you maintain charity when you feel like the walls are closing in around you? And that's really a tough situation. So, Craig, I'm not a believer. There's this belief, the Calvinistic belief, and you probably know what I'm talking about here. That God somehow sits on the clouds and he's pointing with his finger down and, this fire and brimstone approach. I honestly don't believe we have a God like that. But, does God give us that free will? Does he give us that ability to test? Because, see, my personal belief here is that God wants us to love him because we choose to. So is he giving us the opportunities to find wealth and to find success in worldly ways as a test? What's your thought, Craig?
Oh, that makes sense to me. I'm with you. I don't believe in the angry God version. But our parents tested us. They give you a little bit of freedom, and if they were good parents, they give you a little bit of freedom and see how you do. And if you don't do well, they correct you. And if you do, they give you a little more, and they give you a little more. And I think there's a bit of an analogy here. If we look at kind of a benevolent God that's like our, overarching parent, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think we do get tests every day. And this idea of pursuit of wealth is one of them.
Absolutely. I remember when I first got my first car, I was 16 years old, and my dad bought me this it was a Chrysler Baron. It was like a K car, but it was fancy because it was the Chrysler one. And it had the fake rag top, like that. I don't know what it was, a pleather or something like this. So my dad gives me this car for my 16th birthday. Man, I was living. It was fantastic. It was a 4-cylinder. So I had to use my Fred Flintstone feet to get anywhere. But I remember the first weekend I took it out. And the next morning I got up and I was getting up in the morning. My dad comes up, he's banging on the door. He's like, "We need to talk right now." And I said, "What's going on?" Right? He says, "You come down here right now." And he walks down, we go out to the garage and my car's sitting out there. Well, Sundays around our house was clean the cars day. I think it was my dad's way of teaching us the value of taking care of your stuff. So he says, "I am so angry with you right now." I'm like, "Dad, what's going on?" Right? He goes, "Look in your back seat." And unbeknownst to me, one of my knucklehead friends had decided he was going to put his foot up in the back window. Okay. So we had gone somewhere to a football game or something, and his foot was covered with grass or dirt or something like this. So in the back window is this smudge of just dirt and mud running down the thing. And my dad's like, "Why do I give you nice stuff if you're not going to take care of it?" And I remember that to this day. And that was so many years ago. But he was saying kind of what God is saying to us. And I'm going to test you. I'm going to give you a little bit more. I'm going to give you a little bit more. How are you going to honor that? And I remember, Craig, at first I was mad. I was like, "Dad, what's the big deal? It's just a little mud." But then I realized where he was really going with that. He's thinking, well, if you can't even take care of your own car that you don't even own, because it was like Dad's car, but you can use it, then how are you going to take care of more stuff? And I think that's just something we have to be cognizant of is, I hear a lot of people say, "God's not blessing me. God's not giving me things." Like I had a client it's probably been a year ago, Craig, and he said to me, he says, "Ralph, I just don't understand why my business isn't getting anywhere." And I said to him, "Well, tell me what you think's going on." He goes, "Ralph, I was really making good money." He says, "Man, I was throwing invoices out there, man. I was sticking it to people. Man, I was overpricing stuff and all stuff." I said, "Dude, well, think about what you just said." I said, "You want God to reward you for what you're doing, but you're scamming." He wasn't scamming people, but he was not being as transparent as he could have been, is probably the best way to say it, Craig. But he looks at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, "Dude, you are intentionally giving the double barrel middle finger to God and saying, 'Look, in spite of you, here's what I'm going to do.'" And you wonder why God's not blessing you. And I think it's part of the test as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of short-term thinking is usually a bad idea, period, regardless of whether it's money or something else. I'm gonna get this while I can is not a good way to live.
Yeah, and so many people fall into that trap and then they wonder why they're stuck in this position where and you think about it in your own life. How many times have you made a short-term decision that had lasting consequences? Well, your money's the same way. I recorded a show this morning talking about that. You decide, I don't drink coffee, but I'll pick on the people who go buy these $10 coffees. Well, that might seem like a short-term decision. It's just a small thing. But do that every day for a month, that's $150. And then you say, "I don't have an emergency fund." Well, guess why not? Because you're making a decision every day to go buy a $10 coffee or a $5. Like I said, I don't buy coffee, so I have no idea, but I'm just saying. But I think it goes along with what you're saying there. It's those little decisions that add up to something much bigger.
Right. Absolutely.
Which leads me to, and this isn't a good segue, but we're going to go to the next point. That's point number 6. And that is the wealthy should be generous. And you know what's interesting about this, Craig? I got some real life, like real scenarios here. It's funny. I'll have a client come in and see me, and I get to the point of the conversation. I'll say, hey, let's talk about charitable contributions. And I'll say, did you give anything? Oh yeah, Ralph, I'll tell you what, man, I gave a ton this past year. And I'm like, that's fantastic. That's great. And I'm looking, okay, well, how much did you give? And they'll say, you know what, Ralph, we gave $300. And I'm not judging them, but I'm looking at their tax return. They just made 300 grand. And they thought $300 was a lot, which isn't biblical. The wealthy have a responsibility to be generous. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. It commands us. Now, there are many places in the scripture where it commands, but this is what it says. It says, command those who are rich to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. So my big takeaway from this is generosity isn't optional. It's a command, and it reflects our understanding that everything we have, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, Craig, everything we have belongs to God. And, it's funny because it says, as you get more generous, as you get, and the thing that I have learned in my own life is those times, and I had clients say this to me as well, those times when they were struggling, they pushed and they gave a little bit more, and all of a sudden they were blessed. Now, I'm not one of these prosperity people, give and it'll be, I don't believe that, but the Bible's commanding us to be generous. And listen, here's the thing. A lot of people get hung up on. Think it has to be money. It doesn't have to be money. It can be your time. It can be your experiences. It can be your talents. So Craig, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to make the same point. Money is one way to give, but it's not the only way to give. As you were talking about that, I got to thinking, maybe when you are generous with your money, you're trading one form of wealth for another form of wealth. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, that there are lots of different kinds of wealth, and financial wealth is only one of them. But it could be a good feeling. It could be, honoring God. It could be honoring your family. It could be whatever. But I think it's a little bit of a transaction where you're giving up a little bit of your financial wealth for another form of wealth. So what do you think about that?
I absolutely agree with you. And I think it's just because people view wealth in like the balance sheet, how much is in my account. But you and I, Craig, I think we're on the same page here. We started to realize as we get older is that wealth is not necessarily it's not how much money you have. It could be the relationships. Like you and I have developed a really good friendship, and we've known each other through podcasting, but we've developed a relationship. I've got the same relationship with Mark as in the chat room. You can't value those money wise. It's not a give or take thing, but it's a relationship. And I think you're right. You trade this. One of the things you said a long time ago is you either pay with money or pay with time. And I think this is right in that same realm of what we're talking about here. Investing in other people. Like I said, it doesn't have to be money, but you're building that relationship. Well, guess what? He that dies with the most friends wins. Maybe that's what we're really talking about here, because I think there's wealth in that.
Well, and there's also a ripple effect that we often discount when we're charitable. You give to some charity, you give to some cause, they help some people, that enables those people to help people, and there really is that ripple effect a lot of times when you're generous.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't see it. Like I had a lady, she was an older client. She's passed away a couple of years ago, and she was one of these people that in her church supported missionaries. And she would come in every year to get her work done. I never really understood the whole missionary thing. I'm like, well, why don't you support your church here? And she said to me one time, she goes, Ralph, you don't understand. This dollar reverberates. And she goes, there will be people touched by this who I will never meet my entire life. Well, I will never forget when the lady passed away, they had a service for her. Craig, there was more people than they could fit in a church. And 98% of the people didn't even know who she was, but they knew what she had done. She had set up these missionary things. And you're right. I mean, and that's what it comes down to is the ripple effect of that. But let's move on to point number 7. And we kind of talked about this. We kind of danced around this one, but this is dishonest wealth is cursed. Hey, look, the Bible is clear that dishonest wealth is cursed. Look at Proverbs 13:11. It says this, wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished. I think that's a nice way of saying, don't be dishonest. And we talked about this with my client a few minutes ago, shortcuts and shady deals, they might seem tempting, but they never lead to lasting blessings. And see, one of the things I wanted you to take away today is our faith should inform our ethical practice in business and finance. I wrote a book about this. It's called The Gospel of Entrepreneurship. And you can catch that on my website at askralph.com, but I'm not trying to sell the book today, but I talk about this. And that is, you don't check your Christianity at the door when you have a business. A lot of people don't understand it. They say, well, I don't want to talk about my faith. But what you don't understand is a lot of people will come and do business with you because of your faith. I don't know how many times I'll get a new client, Craig, and they'll say to me, because I always ask them, I say, where did you learn about me? Well, I saw you on Facebook, so I did some investigation. And I like to press them. I say, okay, well, what does your investigation look like? Well, I checked to see if you had a license. I'll be like, well, that's a good check. I mean, it's a good thing to look into. And I said, but then I looked at your website and I noticed you had a scripture at the bottom. And they said, you're the only accountant we found that had a scripture on their website. And, we weren't sure what to think about that, but we're like, well, if anything else, we might not agree with him, but at least he has character. And I think that's part of this. And, and the thing is, if you are going to put yourself out there, and listen, you can choose to be a Christian, you can choose to be whatever you want to be. It's not my place to judge you. But what I do say is, if you think you're going to get by swindling people and taking advantage of people, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work.
Well, even if you don't want to put your Christian faith forward, your business practices still ought to align with your Christian faith. If you feel like
Absolutely.
it's not appropriate to be that upfront about it, people should still know you by your witness.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I'll never forget, it was about 15 years ago. I was working with a local fire company. And on the bottom of all my emails, I have a scripture, and sometimes I'll change it around or something. Well, one of the fire people, they sent me this blasted email. They said, how dare you send us a Christian-based, message at the bottom of your email? We're a fire company. We don't need to hear about that stuff. And I said, Craig, it was fun because this was a main client of mine at the time. I mean, this was the major, for an accountant, it was a big, what we'll call a big account for me. And it was a spiritual crossroad for me. Because the path of least resistance would have been, let me email this guy back and say, you're right. Let me take that the Bible message off my emails. But I really thought about it. I prayed about it. And I said, here's what I say to the guy. I apologize if I offended you. And that's all I said. It didn't change the dynamic because what you just said is pointed, Craig. And that is, you don't have to wear it per se, but the ethical practices of your business should be part of that. And like I said, I think you can go overboard with it. And maybe at times I've been overboard with it. As I get older, I guess I just don't care as much. When I was young and trying to find that next client and all, it was like, that was important to me. Like, I didn't want to offend anybody. And this is going to get a little bit controversial, but I think we live in this time of like, everybody's so afraid of offending people. And I just don't know how effective that is to be human. I had a client in the other day, I used the word, you're going to love this one as being an educator, a human beingness. I think I made that word up. But you know what? It's okay to be human. It's okay to have character. It's okay to do this. And I think that, and like I said, I don't want to go down a whole rabbit hole of, political beliefs and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? If you believe in something, as long as it's not something that is directly offensive, like if you say to me, like, hey, I'm a believer in the church of cut people's throats. I mean, that's ridiculous, but I'm just saying, like, that would be an issue. But if your basic tenets of your faith are, I treat people with respect, I give unto others, I do all those things, and I say, wear that proudly. What do you think, Craig?
Absolutely. Although I would temper it with a little bit of humility as well. I mean, there are basic things that are part of your character that you just, they just are who you are. But there's a lot of stuff around the edges that are really not core beliefs that we sometimes get stuck in and think our way of viewing it is the only way to view it. And that's really not the case. We always need to, Jesus was very, very humble, especially given who he was. I would have been very arrogant if I was the son of God. I'm just putting that out there. But, we need to have a little bit of that humility as well and be accepting that there are people that have different views than we have, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean you should change who you are.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And it's funny because I don't know how many churches I've been in where they had a church split because of the choice of carpet. They literally, the church broke up because they were building a new, a building for the church. And oh man, they wanted to put red carpet in, but this group over here wanted green carpet. And, this group, you can't have a drum set in front of church. And like I said, we're doing all the things we shouldn't talk about, Craig. But I'm just saying, it's just funny though. But like, I love what you said there, Craig, and is have some humility. And I think that it's easy to not be humble these days. And I think you really nailed that, which leads me to point number 8. And that is contentment is better than wealth. And I think that's something we really need to key on. And Proverbs 15:16 says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. And I read that when I was preparing for the show, and I thought, you know what? That is a very, very good verse to sort of internalize. I'm a believer in memorizing scripture. And it's not something I've really done a lot till the last like 6 months or so. But I thought this was a great one. Better is a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure in trouble. And it goes along the lines kind of what you said, Craig, and that is peace and a relationship with God are worth more than any amount of money. That's not exactly what you were saying. But you were saying, look, stand for what you believe in,
Right.
but have humility around it. And we can say the same thing about our wealth. Are we content with what we have, or are we always chasing that next big thing? I don't know about you, Craig, but I've met people, especially in the business world. I mean, they just never is enough of. There's never enough for them. They get this and they want this. They get this and they want this, I actually feel sad for them, because it's like there is never going to be anything that's going to truly fill that tank, and that's just a tragedy. They don't understand what contentment is. And go through something. Like I said this to my younger son the other day. He was belly aching. He's 23 years old. He's got everything going for him. And he goes, Dad, I just feel so depressed and anxious all the time. And I said, son, you don't realize how good you have it. And it's easy for me to say that, right? But I said, son, you don't have to struggle to get out of bed in the morning. You have arms and legs that work. And I said, I think that's one of our problems as human beings is we don't realize what other people go through. And we it's the woe is me mentality of like, oh, things are so bad. But how many times do we get up in the morning and just have contentment? One of the things I talk about on my show all the time is keep a contentment journal. Journal what the things you should be content. God has given us, if you live in the United States of America, for the most part, you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
When you go to the sink to turn the water on, in most places, and I'm not speaking for everybody because there are tough places in the United States, I'm not saying it, the water works. The electric, you turn the light switch on, the electric works. You go to third world countries. My aunt was a missionary in some of the third world countries, and like clean drinking water, that's a premium.
Well, a place to sleep. I spent a month in India,
Oh, wow.
and that's poverty. I remember I left my flight out of Mumbai, left very early in the morning, and so we were driving to the airport at probably 3 in the morning. Whole families sleeping in doorways if they were lucky. At least they weren't sleeping on the sidewalk. And so, yeah, if you're watching this or listening to this, you're at the upper end of the wealth curve globally. So, yeah, we should not forget that. Can I quote Sheryl Crow here?
Go right for it, man.
So it's she's got a line in one of her songs that says, "It's not having what you want; it's wanting what you've got." And I think that's a good way to look at it. Is just be content with what you have, uh, because you're probably a lot better off than the vast majority of the people on the face of the earth. I have a question for you though, Ralph.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in that verse, uses the word fear.
Mhm.
I don't think that means exactly what we normally mean by fear, does it?
No, I don't think so. I think, and that gets back to that whole Calvinistic discussion, right? And I think, and look, I am not a Bible scholar by any stretch, but my belief in that fear means, have some understanding, have some appreciation. I think that's better the word to use. It's funny. We talked about, when our parents, when we were young, they gave us a little rope, right? A little bit of rope. And for me, like my dad was one of these domineering guys, and it was fear. But when I looked at it as I got older, it was the false fear. It was just respect,
Yeah,
and it
that
was, and I think that's probably the word you were going for. I don't want to
no,
speak
that
for you,
that's
but,
no, that's
and
exactly where I was going. A combination of love and respect
yeah,
is the way I read that word. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that because I
no,
think that confuses a lot of people because that fear concept pops up again and again and again. And I remember when I was reading it as a little kid, it was like, I'm supposed to be afraid of God, which just didn't make sense in my little brain. So I just wanted to make sure we brought that up.
and Craig, listen, I'm going to take a sidetrack here because I think that, and I'm going through this metamorphosis in my own life. I think your view of God has a lot to do with your relationship with your father here on earth. I just really believe it does because I think I'll speak for myself. As a young boy, I think your first relationship with a man is your father for the most part, if you're fortunate to have mom and dad at home. And I think that you're going to view that relationship with your dad, you're gonna put that onto God, I think, and so I gotta be honest with you. When I was young, my dad was this like domineering dude, like, that pointing the finger down at you. And to be honest with you, Craig, I did think God was like that. I'm gonna be very candid with you. I thought God was this guy, man, if you step out of line, he's gonna rain down hellfire on you. That was my belief. I'm just being honest with you. And it took me a long time as I got older to really understand what was wrong with that because you have this preconceived notion of what God looks like based on that father relationship here on earth. And I think you're right. It's like, I think we have to be careful of that because we don't want to put out the belief structure that it's nothing more because like Mark said in the chat, and he's absolutely right. It's respect.
Right.
It's love and respect. And it's like kind of like the respect you have for your wife if you're married, right? The Bible says that as men, we should love our wives as Christ loved the church. Well, that's a respect thing. And it's not the fear of like he's going to take you out because listen, if God wanted to take us out, he could, right? Let's just be honest. Like, I think most people believe that, right? But it's that respect. So I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think we really have to. So if you're struggling with this right now, if you're listening to this or watching this right now, and you're thinking, yeah, but I've never thought about God in anything but fear. I'm going to challenge you to think about that. I'm going to challenge you to pray about that because that was something I had to go through. And it was hard for me because like when I was raising my two boys, and I got to give my wife a lot of credit because I was not the greatest father when it came to that because I was a tape player. I had this pre-recorded of what I had learned, right, as a child, right? So when my kids were young, I didn't understand grace. I didn't understand those things that truly the definition of God is. So if you're in that right now, that's one of the things I counsel young people, I want to say young people who are just having kids right now. I'm like, think about this. Like your sons or your daughters are going to look to you with like, what does God look like to me? And I think we have such, there's so much value in that, but there's also, we need to be aware of that because we are going to put that on that child or that teenage kid for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, let's move on to point number 9. And this one's going to get controversial again. And that is wealth can't save you. And I'm just going to repeat that. Ultimately, wealth can't save you. The book of Proverbs 11:4 says this, wealth is worthless in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. And I think we need to realize that. I remember growing up, you always thought, send all your money to this church. Money can't buy eternal life. It just doesn't. What has eternal value? Well, ultimately, it's our relationship with Jesus. I mean, that's what it comes down to. If you think you're going to get this layer of wealth and it's going to, I picture it almost like you get to the pearly gates, kind of a silly thing to talk about, but like, you got suitcases full of money and you get to the pearly gates and you're like, oh, let me in. I got cash. Guess what? You're going to be out of luck because they don't take that currency there.
But do they take Apple Pay?
Well, you know what? They might. I don't know. I think Apple, I'm going to be careful what I say here. Apple might think they're God, but anyway, we'll leave that one for where it is. But no, I think it's important to understand that because I think there's so many people out there to think, they're going to get wealth and they're going to find this salvation because of it. And let me just tell you, and I've said this on the show before, some of the most wealthy people I know are the most miserable people I've ever met. And some of the lowest is the wrong word to use, but some of the people who struggle the most are some of the most kind, some of the most compassionate, some of the most beautiful people I've ever met. And they don't have two nickels to rub together. But like, guess what, Craig? They respect everything they have. They respect the provision that God has given them. And I just think we need to be careful of that.
Absolutely. Although I will say that having a certain amount of wealth can protect you from certain things. I know, you and Mark talked about that on his podcast. And so, having a little bit of wealth can cushion you, but I can speak from experience. If someone that you love has terminal cancer, it doesn't matter how much money you've got. You can fly all over the world. If it's time, it's time. That's just the way it is. And so all that wealth, I'm talking about, physical life
Sure.
here, but it's just more so with eternal life.
Absolutely true. Yeah. And I hear that from clients all the time. I've got a client, she was in yesterday. She's battling, this is her second round of cancer. She had breast cancer 15 years ago, and now she has ovarian cancer. And but you talk about somebody who is just happy to be alive, Craig. She came in, she had no hair left. She looks like a stiff breeze will blow over, and she had a smile from ear to ear. And I said to her, I said, what's going on? She goes, Ralph, I got diagnosed with cancer again. She goes, but guess what? The Lord's going to see me through in this. And I'm thinking, she has every reason to be upset. She has every reason to be angry. She has every reason to be sad. But she knows a truth that most people don't get. And that is that she's going to get through this one way or another. It might not be the way that everybody thinks, oh, she's going to be cured. Well, maybe that's, she even said that to me. Just remembered as she said it. She goes, Ralph, she said, when I got diagnosed this time, the doctor said something to me. He said this, I can't cure you of this cancer. He says, but I can put you in remission. And that might live you 10 years, 15 years, whatever that looks like. And I remember her saying, she said, Ralph, she says, that was the best thing I ever heard. And I'm thinking to myself, Craig, I'm examining my own and saying, if the doctor told me I had cancer, he couldn't cure me, I don't think I'd be feeling very happy about that.
No.
But it spoke to
But
something deeper.
well, that's right. And if you're a Christian, the grief should be for the ones you've left behind, not for where you're going. But that's easy to say in the abstract, not so easy to live in the moment. But
Absolutely. Which leads me right to point number 10. And that is God cares more about your heart than your wallet. And that's just the truth. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7. It reminds us this. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And for God, our net worth doesn't define our worth in his eyes. And I think so many times people get hung up on that as well. I've heard stories about, you go to one of these old backwoods Christian churches, and everybody's all dressed up to the nines on a Sunday, and in walks this guy that looks like he just fell off the bum bus. I mean, he's disheveled, and he comes walking in, and everybody turns their head and they kind of look like, where's this guy coming from? And, it's so easy for us to get judgmental about that. But we got to remember, God doesn't care what it's looked like on the outside. It's what's on the inside that matters.
right, right. They need those people need to come to the cowboy church. We'll set them straight on how to dress for
Oh, you got to
church.
tell me about the cowboy church. Now you dropped that one. So let's
It's
talk about it.
literally this. I'm not making this up. It's the cowboy church at the OK Corral. So it literally has a rodeo arena, the whole 9 yards, in the middle of the woods, middle of nowhere, dogs in the sanctuary, but nobody's worried about how you're dressed there.
That's very cool. I used to ride motorcycles, Craig. I'll tell you a funny story about you talk about the type of church. And I had a big old Harley, right? And this one day we were out doing one of these charity rides, and this pastor comes up to me and goes, hey man, you got to come to our church. I'm like, well, tell me about your church. He goes, Ralph, it's the biker church. And I'm thinking, oh, I got to see this, right? So you talk about a fun loving bunch of Christian people. Man, they were decked out with tattoos and they had the Harley stuff on, but to love the Lord, man, I'm telling you what, man, you couldn't touch that. They all pulled up with their motorcycles. I mean, it looked like a rally at Sturgis, but it was their church, man. So I totally get where you're saying. And Craig, before we close out, I want to leave us with this last one. And I think this is I've said takeaway a couple times, but this is my big takeaway for today. If you don't hear anything else I talked about that Craig and I talked about today, and that's this point 11. And that is, you can't serve both God and money. And this is a challenging truth. You can't serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24 is crystal clear about this. We have to choose. Who are you, or what are you truly having your allegiance to? And Craig, I think, as humans, as that human beingness that I talked about, this is a constant battle. And it's something we need to be aware of because, and I've learned this in my own life, you can't serve two masters. You just can't. And that's why one of the reasons I launched this show. Back in November 2023, I was just doing a business show and I said, you know what, there's something bigger to this. And I said, what can I bring to, and a lot of people are still kind of confounded by it. Like, well, Ralph, well, you talk about faith and you talk about finances, but we were always taught to not bring the two together. But guess what? At their core, they are the same. And it's a question of, are you serving God? Are you serving man? Are you serving your money? And that's why I do this show, because I think there's so much value in that. Craig, what are your thoughts?
Well, throughout this whole live stream, I keep thinking money is a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. And so if you can use your money, your financial wealth to make the world a better place, to better serve God, then you bring those two things together. So it's not money or God, it's how you think about and how you use money that either honors God or does not honor God. And that's kind of my view of it.
And that you nailed it. And that's the whole point. And that's the whole point of the whole thing, because, one of the things when I thought about, how do I get people to get to the next level? One of the things I've been embracing in my show lately is this thought that a lot of us are stuck in this, I call it cycle of financial shame. We've made decisions. We made bad decisions. Listen, I've made bad decisions. Craig, I don't want to speak for you, but I bet you've made bad financial decisions. But you don't have to stay stuck in that cycle, that cycle of just feeling trapped. I call it the paycheck to paycheck cycle, whatever that is. Because if you get what we're talking about today, there is a path forward. And it's not the path that everybody expects. It's not that path of, well, just go work more. Yeah, you might have to do that. Or just go save more. Yeah, you're going to do that. But it's why you're doing it. And I think that's the key takeaway. So the key takeaways for today, stewardship, we talked about that. We talked about the dangers of the love of money. We talked about the importance of generosity, the priority of spiritual riches. And we talked about the sovereignty of God. And listen, these principles, have to guide our everyday financial decisions. And remember, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to close out with this as we get ready to close out today. God owns it all. And our role, guess what? We're managers. We're managers. We're managing what God has given us. Some of us, he's given more to. Some of us, he gives less. So we ask the question, where do we go from here? And that's really the question I answer on the show every day. So I'm going to encourage you to join our community. You can do that by going to, let me put up this slide so I don't forget. You go to AskRalphPodcast.com/newsletter. We've got a community there. If you join us, you will find I share daily information about how to grow in your faith and how to grow your finances at the same time, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. So, Craig, again, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here with me, Craig. We had a great discussion today. And, I really do appreciate you taking time to join us.
All right. Thanks, Ralph. I appreciate it.
And each of you, I want to thank you for joining me. And as I close, remember the truths we discussed today and put them into practice. Put them into practice in your everyday life, and you'll be amazed at just how impactful they will be. So as I always close the show, I always say this every day, Craig, stay financially savvy out there, and may God bless you abundantly.
Thank you for joining us on the Ask Ralph Show. And with a simple click to subscribe, we'll invite you back to our next episode. And remember, financial issues don't have to be complicated. Just ask Ralph. The information contained in this episode of Ask Ralph is based on data available as of the date of its release. Saggio Accounting Plus and Ask Ralph Media, Inc. is under no obligation to update this content if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances, and any information provided is not to be considered as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please consult your tax advisor or attorney before acting on any material covered.